The first thing you must understand is this. The frontier was not just a place of freedom, it was a crucible. It was a theater where men were stripped bare and forced to confront forces older, darker, and more merciless than the governments that claimed to own the land. Imagine it, January 1886, the Dakota Prairie. Outside, the night shrieks at 40 below, a cold so profound it feels less like weather and more like an executioner. The wind claws at the cabin walls like a predator probing for flesh. Inside, a family huddles around a cast-iron stove, counting every ember as if it were a coin of survival. They whisper, they ration, they endure. But behind that endurance lies a truth that history doesn't often tell you. Survival out here was not only about firewood, furs, or food. It was about psychological control. It was about who had the power to bend and who would break. You see, when men came west, they believed they were escaping the chains of civilization. Tax collectors, kings, priests, institutions that dictated what they should think, how they should pray, and how they should die. But the frontier carried its own invisible chains. The land itself was the first master, a force that reduced the strongest men to desperate beggars before the snow was done with them. To survive, you had to become something other than civilized. You had to relearn truths long buried by city walls and polished sermons. You had to admit that life was not built upon comfort. It was built upon discipline, secrecy, and power. Look deeper at those log cabins and sod houses we romanticize. Do you really think they were just structures of wood and earth? No, they were symbols. Each one was a fortress of will against the endless night. Every family that endured winter without vanishing into white oblivion was not merely lucky. They were inducted, forged, initiated into something primal. This was as not survival. This was initiation into an older law. The law of endurance, of scarcity, of ritual preparation. A law whispered in every icy gust that rattled the shutters. You are alone. No one is coming to save you. What you do now will echo forever. Consider the psychology of those nights. Families shut in for weeks, sometimes months. Snow piled to the windowsills, food dwindling. The walls close in. The wind howls like a voice reminding you that you are prey. And outside, the prairie stretches endless and indifferent. Do you understand what that does to a mind? Civilization teaches dependence, roads, markets, trade, supply. But here, in this crucible, all of that collapsed. The frontier rewired men. It taught them to rely on nothing but themselves, their fire, their planning, their bloodline. A single mistake, a misplaced log, a forgotten ration, a poorly sealed wall, could end the story of your family. This was not life. This was a wager, placed every autumn, collected every spring. And yet, while the textbooks will tell you about sod houses, about buffalo hides and iron stoves, they will not tell you the darker truth. That winter was a test designed not merely by nature, but by powers older and more cunning. You think the families of the West simply survived through strength and cleverness? No, they survived because they submitted to a rhythm, a hidden discipline, one carried through generations like an unspoken covenant. Men cut wood not only for heat, but as if they were offering tribute to some invisible overseer. Women canned vegetables and salted meat not just to feed their children, but to guard against a famine that seemed to descend with intelligence, as if the cold itself were hunting them. These rituals of survival were not just practical, they were psychological control systems enforced by the land itself, and if you failed the ritual, the land erased you. Think about the stories you never hear, the families who didn't survive, the cabins found empty in spring, tables still set, food untouched, firewood stacked. Some historians chalk these vanishings up to blizzards, starvation, or disease. But you and I, let's not be naive. Entire bloodlines disappeared in the silence of winter because they broke the rhythm, because they underestimated the price of survival. The frontier had no patience for weakness. It devoured the unprepared, the careless, the soft. And in doing so, it whispered its lesson. Only those who embrace the cold, who understand the hunger, who bow to the ancient law, can endure. This is what they never taught you in school. Survival was never about just keeping warm. It was about transformation. Winter remade men. It cut them off from the illusions of progress and forced them to remember truths buried beneath centuries of comfort. The truth that survival is power, the truth that civilization is fragile, the truth that comfort makes you weak, but hardship makes you sovereign. Every winter was a ceremony of purification, fire, hunger, silence, ice. And those who emerged in spring were not the same as those who entered in autumn. They were harder, sharper, more dangerous, more awake. And now I will ask you a question. The same question that winter asked every frontier family when the wind screamed through the eaves and the temperature fell past 40 below. Will you bend or will you break? Will you cower in the illusion of safety, or will you embrace the storm and let it carve you into something unshakable? Because make no mistake, the same law that ruled the Dakota Prairie in 1886 still rules today. Winter has many forms: cold, scarcity, isolation, struggle. The names change, the centuries turn, but the test remains the same. And if you are listening to this, if you can feel these words sinking into you, then maybe, just maybe, you are ready to face it. Imagine the silence. Outside, the snow presses against the windows like a shroud, the prairie stretched into an endless coffin of white. Inside, only the crackle of fire remains, a faint pulse against the crushing stillness. It was in this silence that men discovered the most terrifying truth. The frontier wasn't testing their muscles, it was testing their minds. It wasn't the cold alone that killed, but the madness born from isolation, hunger, and the slow erosion of hope. When winter sank its claws, it turned cabins into prisons and families into test subjects. Do you see now? The frontier was more than land. It was an invisible experiment, an examination of how far the human psyche could bend before it shattered. The records speak of log cabins insulated with moss, of buffalo robes spread across children to trap warmth, of sod walls thick enough to muffle the wind. But what do those details conceal? They conceal the psychological warfare waged by the land itself. Winter did not strike once. It lingered unrelenting, probing for weakness day after day, week after week. Men chopped wood until their hands bled. But when they paused, even for a moment, the silence whispered, "It will never be enough." Women preserved food, stacking shelves with jars and salted meat, yet each night the cold mocked them. This will not last. The prairie was not indifferent. It was cunning, patient, and cruel. It understood that once your mind was broken, your body would follow. Why do you think so many families vanished in the blizzards of 86 and 87? Why do you think whole households were found lifeless in their cabins come spring, firewood untouched, food still on the shelves? Do not swallow the easy explanations. Yes, some froze, some starved, some fell to sickness, but others fell to something much darker. Winter eroded their will. A man can swing an axe, a woman can cook a meal. But what happens when the silence grows louder than your own heartbeat? When every creak of the rafters sounds like a death knell? That is when families turned inward, when fathers stared into the fire too long, when mothers whispered prayers into the darkness and heard nothing in return. And that is when madness entered the cabin. Understand this. Survival was not simply a matter of shelter and food. It was a battle of psychological control. Frontier families did not just build cabins, they built rituals. They rationed firewood with obsessive precision. They spoke in hushed tones, as though silence itself might hear them and grow hungry. They passed down rules like commandments: never let the fire die, never waste a crumb, never leave the animals unfed. These were not just practical instructions, they were mantras, spells to ward off despair. Without them, the family mind would fracture, and once fractured, winter would consume them. But here is where the forbidden truth creeps in. What if these rituals were not only survival strategies, but continuations of something older? The settlers who came west were not blank slates. They carried with them ancestral memories, old-world superstitions, whispered charms against hunger and frost, remnants of pagan practices buried under Christian hymns. On the frontier, stripped of churches, stripped of civilization, many of these habits returned. Families placed charms above their doors, carved patterns into wood beams, whispered words before sleep to keep the cold from stealing their children. They would never admit it in public, never write it in a diary, but in the midnight hours, when the frost crawled across the walls like a living thing, they remembered the old ways, because deep down, they understood. Survival was not only a matter of heat, it was a matter of willpower, of aligning yourself against forces that were not merely natural but supernatural. Historians will tell you about buffalo chips burned for fuel, about corn husks twisted into makeshift kindling, but they will not tell you how some families swore they saw figures in the blizzards, shapes moving against the storm, shadows that watched from beyond the snowdrifts. They will not tell you how some mothers claimed the wind carried voices, calling the names of their children. And yet the records remain. Strange reports buried in forgotten archives. Were these hallucinations born of isolation, or glimpses of something darker that lurked in the cold? Either way, the result was the same. Fear rooted deep in the mind, and fear is the sharpest tool of control. Do you see the pattern? Winter was not only an enemy, it was a teacher. It stripped men of their illusions and forced them into confrontation with themselves. Weakness was exposed. Secrets came to light. Families discovered whether they were bound by loyalty or whether hunger would turn them into rivals. Survival was not only about resisting the cold, it was about mastering the self. It was about staring into the abyss of scarcity, madness, and death, and refusing to blink. This is why I tell you, the frontier was not merely physical, it was a psychological proving ground. Governments, institutions, kings, they rule by comfort, by giving men food, warmth, distraction. But the frontier, it ruled by deprivation. It revealed who you really were when stripped of everything. That is the truth they don't want you to grasp. You do not find your strength in ease. You find it in exposure, in danger, in the nights when you are sure you will not live to see dawn. And so I ask you, if you were there, in that cabin, when the wind screamed at 40 below and the fire was little more than embers, what would you have done? Would you have clung to the rituals, feeding the fire as if it were an altar? Would you have kept your silence, whispering no weakness into the dark? Or would the cold have broken you, whispering your name until you followed it into the snow? Because here is the secret. Winter still exists. Maybe not in the Dakota Plains, maybe not outside your window, but it is there, in every hardship, in every silence, in every trial that strips you bare. And the question remains the same as it was in 1886. Will you bend or will you break? You've been told that frontier survival was about grit, about chopping wood, about stockpiling food, but that's only the surface. Beneath that story, beneath the clean textbook explanations, lurks a deeper reality. Survival was a ritual, and rituals, whether settlers admitted it or not, carry power. Think about it. Every autumn, families worked as if they were priests preparing an altar. They felled trees, split logs, stacked them in neat piles. They salted meat, sealed jars, buried root cellars into the earth. To the casual eye, it looks practical, but look closer, it's ceremonial. The woodpile was not just fuel, it was a sacrifice offered to winter. The cellar was not just storage, it was a tomb filled with life, hidden underground, waiting to be resurrected in the dead season. And the stove was the altar itself, the fiery heart of the household where warmth and food were transformed into survival. Do you see it? The frontier family was not merely living, they were performing. Every act, every precaution, every ritual was an acknowledgement of the hidden contract. Obey the winter's law or be erased from history. This is why those who survived were not the strongest, nor even the cleverest. They were the most disciplined, the ones who treated preparation like scripture, the ones who lived as if every ember, every scrap, every silence had meaning. That is why I tell you this was not mere survival, it was initiation. Those who endured winter were transformed. Those who failed it were sacrificed to the land. And here lies the forbidden truth. Much of what kept them alive was not born from European ingenuity, but from knowledge stolen. Yes, stolen from the indigenous tribes who had endured those same winters for centuries before. Moccasins layered with fur, hides used as insulation, pemmican that could last a year without spoiling. These were not inventions of settler, as they were gifts of necessity from native peoples. But do the history books tell you that? No, because to admit it would be to admit that survival on the frontier was not a tale of rugged independence, but of dependence on wisdom that the settlers tried to erase. They wanted the land, not the people. They wanted the techniques, not the truth. So they adopted the methods, buried the credit, and rewrote the story. That is institutional manipulation, the theft of memory itself. And yet, in the long dark nights of January, some families remembered. They whispered the same words, wore the same hides, carried out the same rituals as the tribes around them. It was not spoken openly, for fear of ridicule or worse. But behind closed doors, frontier survival was not white man's progress. It was the continuation of ancient law, the same law whispered in the crackle of fire and the shriek of wind: adapt or perish. Now I ask you to consider something darker. What happens to a mind when survival itself becomes ritualized? When every act of chopping wood, every mouthful of stew, every log placed on the stove is performed with the weight of life and death? The human mind begins to bend. It begins to see meaning in every shadow, every flicker of light. And in that bending, in that search for meaning, doorways open. Doorways that civilized men pretend don't exist. The journals of some settlers speak of dreams. Dreams where the cold itself had a voice, where the wind spoke in riddles, where firelight revealed shapes moving in the corners of cabins. Were these hallucinations? Or were they visions born from a mind stretched thin by ritual, silence, and suffering? Either way, the effect was the same. The frontier was not just testing bodies, it was testing souls. And here is where you must face the truth. The frontier winter was not a season, it was an initiation into power. Those who endured were not simply survivors, they were remade, hardened, forged in silence, hunger, and ritual. This is why spring meant more than relief, it meant rebirth. The ones who walked out of the blizzard were no longer ordinary men. They were initiates. They had stared into the abyss, felt it stare back, and lived to tell the tale. But you must understand, not all initiations are completed. Some broke under the weight, families shattered, fathers abandoned their posts, mothers fell into despair, children froze in beds while parents lost themselves to madness, and the land claimed them without pity. These are the stories that history buries, because they reveal too much. They reveal that survival is not guaranteed. They reveal that the frontier was not only a place of opportunity, it was a place of sacrifice. For every family that thrived, another was erased. For every survivor who was hardened into a weapon, another was shattered into dust. And isn't that the lesson hidden in plain sight? Survival is not a universal blessing. It is selective. It is brutal. It demands a price. The families who endured the winters of the 1800s did not simply make it through. They paid for it. With blood, with sanity, with silence. And that is why their rituals mattered. Rituals are not empty habits. They are the glue that holds the mind together when everything else seeks to tear it apart. Without ritual, there is no survival. Without ritual, there is only madness and snow. Now I turn to you, because whether you know it or not, you are still living in a frontier, not of prairie and snow, but of lies, scarcity, and systems that want to keep you blind. Your winters are not storms. They are hardships, betrayals, collapses of trust. And just like the men of Dakota in 1886, you face the same question. Will you break under the silence, or will you forge rituals of power that carry you through? If you are hearing this, it is no accident. This is your fire in the storm. This is your initiation, and if you want to claim your place among those who endure, then prove it now. Go to the comments and write twice the phrase, "I endure the winter." Write it twice so it is sealed, not just with words but with will, because only by ritual do men endure, only by ritual do they awaken. Do you think the frontier was a land of freedom? That's the lie they still feed you. Men fleeing the east thought they were escaping governments, kings, taxes, the suffocating grip of institutions. But the truth is darker. Freedom is a mirage. Even in the wilderness, control followed them. It just changed its face. The cabin was not only a shelter, it was a system. It was a cell where rituals of obedience and hierarchy were reinforced night after night while the storm raged outside. Understand this. In a frontier household, there was no democracy. There was order. The father was the firekeeper, the rationer, the judge. His voice decided how long the embers would burn, how much food would be saved, who would sleep nearest the stove. The mother was the steward of provisions, the silent general of the cellar, calculating portions like a priestess counting coins for the altar. Children were not innocent. They were labor, tasked with hauling water, tending animals, gathering fuel. Every member of the household had a role, and any deviation risked collapse. It was not freedom, it was rule, and the cold enforced it without mercy. But here's the hidden pattern. These family hierarchies mirrored the very institutions the settlers thought they had left behind. Governments, churches, monarchies, they were all built on command, obedience, ritual. And when stripped of civilization, what did families rebuild? The exact same systems, authority at the top, duty beneath, ritual at the center. The frontier did not liberate men, it revealed how deeply their minds were programmed to replicate control. Now look deeper. Think of the cast iron stove, heavy, black, squatting in the center of the room. It gave heat, it gave food, it gave life, but it also demanded attention, sacrifice, constant tribute of fuel. The family orbited it, fed it, cleaned it, obeyed its rhythm. Does this sound familiar? Of course it does. The stove was a new altar, a substitute throne. Fire was not just warmth, it was worship. A frontier family without fire was nothing. A frontier family with fire bent themselves to its demands, and so the cycle of control was reborn, disguised as necessity. Now imagine the psychological toll, weeks without leaving the cabin. The wind screaming, the walls groaning, frost etching patterns across the windows like cryptic symbols. Families lived in two worlds at once, the physical and the mental. The physical demanded wood, food, clothing, order. But the mental demanded belief. Belief that spring would come, belief that fire would hold, belief that their suffering meant something. Without belief, discipline collapsed. Without discipline, survival ended. That's why rituals mattered more than logic. Families told stories by lamplight, not because they were bored, but because stories reinforced identity. They sang hymns not always because they believed, but because the repetition drowned out the whispers of despair. Control was not just physical, it was psychological, and it was absolute. And yet, whisper this truth. Control systems breed secrets. Fathers ruled, but they feared rebellion. Mothers rationed, but they feared resentment. Children obeyed, but they dreamed of freedom. In some cabins, silence held. In others, cracks formed. Arguments turned to violence. Families collapsed inward. The storm outside was merciless, but sometimes the storm inside was worse. Now you begin to see the shadow. The frontier was not a clean slate, it was a theater of hidden agendas. Governments in the East encouraged migration west not just for land, but for control, push families into isolation, force them to build hierarchies, to submit to ritual, to pass obedience through bloodlines. What better way to forge a people who would never question authority? The West was sold as freedom, but in truth, it was discipline disguised as destiny. Every cabin became a cell, every winter, a test. Those who survived did not escape the system, they became its most faithful servants, shaped in silence, scarred by scarcity, trained by ritual. And here's the most unsettling thought. The winter did not end in March. Yes, the snow melted, the grass returned, the rivers flowed, but the discipline remained. The children who had been rationed learned scarcity as law. The mothers who had whispered prayers learned silence as duty. The fathers who ruled the stove carried authority like iron into the spring. They had been forged, yes, but forged into what? Into men who obeyed the ritual of survival so deeply they would carry it into every other system they touched. The winter was the hidden school, the frontier was the hidden classroom, and the graduates carried their training into towns, into institutions, into the very machinery of the nation. This is why I tell you, survival was not just survival, it was indoctrination, a silent shaping of minds through scarcity, ritual and fear. And this shaping did not die with the frontier, it lives on in you. Look around your life, look at the rituals you keep, the hierarchies you obey, the comforts you worship as altars. Do you think you are free, or have you simply traded the cast iron stove for another throne? Another fire to feed, another ritual to obey? The frontier families survived the coldest nights of winter, But survival was not free. They paid with obedience. They paid with submission to ancient rhythms disguised as natural law, and those who endured passed down the code: discipline, scarcity, silence, ritual. It is in your blood now. You are still living by laws you never chose, and so I ask you again, do you want to endure as they did? Or do you want to awaken to the truth they could never admit, that survival, while powerful, can also be a cage? You've been told the land was empty. Harsh, yes, but empty. They called it untamed, unclaimed, wilderness. A blank page waiting for settlers to write their story. But that was another lie, one of the most dangerous of all. The land was never empty. It was alive, it was listening, and it was choosing who would stay and who would vanish. Think about it. How many families disappeared without a trace? Cabins left abandoned, food still on the table, doors hanging open, no footprints in the snow. Official records call it starvation, migration, or Indian raids. But ask yourself, why do the details never add up? Why were meals left uneaten? Why were fires still burning? Why were families simply gone? If the land was nothing but soil and wind, where did they go? Who, or what, took them? The truth whispered in the journals, in the folklore, in the nightmares is this: the land itself was selective. It did not simply kill the weak. It absorbed them, and those who survived felt it too. They wrote about the sense of being watched in the blizzards, about hearing voices in the timberline when no one was there, about shapes too large, too still, standing beyond the glow of lamplight. Survivors swore that some winters felt like trials, as if unseen forces were weighing their worth, measuring their discipline, testing their devotion. The indigenous tribes had known this long before settlers arrived. They told stories of spirits in the wind, guardians in the trees, watchers in the snow. They understood the land as intelligent, dangerous, alive. But the settlers, proud and blind, dismissed it as superstition. They learned the truth the hard way. For some, it was in the screams carried by night winds. For others, in the way their livestock bolted as if chased by something unseen. For many, it was in the silence, the kind of silence so deep it pressed on the chest like a hand, smothering, breath erasing thought. Survival on the frontier was not simply physical, it was spiritual. You were being judged. Every night, every ritual, every choice was weighed. Fail, and you didn't just die, you vanished. You were erased from history as if you had never existed at all. This is why some families clung so desperately to their fires, to their songs, to their prayers. They were not just keeping warm, they were holding the land at bay. They were feeding their own souls enough light to keep the darkness from claiming them. Now look at the pattern with new eyes. Winters were not random hardships, they were ordeals. They came in cycles like clockwork, each one a culling, each one demanding a sacrifice. Sometimes the sacrifice was livestock, sometimes it was food, sometimes it was blood. Families who endured often whispered that someone always had to pay. A child fell sick, a father froze outside hunting, a mother wasted away giving her portion to the rest. The land took what it wanted, and only then did it allow the rest to survive. What does this mean? It means the frontier was not a human story. It was a pact written in ice and blood, a pact where survival was bought, not given, and the land enforced its contract mercilessly. Think of the stories you've heard of cabin fever, the madness of long winters, the violence, the paranoia. Modern psychology explains it as isolation. But ask yourself, why did so many accounts describe the same hallucinations, the same visions of figures outside the windows, of whispers in the dark, of faces in the firelight? Were these shared delusions, or were they glimpses of the same intelligence that owned the land? There are reports, rare, hidden, of families who refused to play by the rules. They mocked the rituals, wasted their stores, neglected the fire. And in spring their cabins were found empty. Food still on shelves, beds still made, but no bodies, no struggle, just absence. Neighbors whispered they had been taken by the land, taken by the winter, taken because they broke the pact. And here's the truth they will never print in your school books. The land still remembers, it still chooses. The soil you walk on is the same soil that swallowed them. The winds that whistle past your window tonight are the same winds that carried voices across the plains 2 centuries ago, and just because you live in houses of concrete and steel does not mean you are free. The land is older than your cities, the silence is older than your machines, and both are patient. Do you see it now? The frontier was never about conquering wilderness, it was about appeasing it. The settlers did not tame the land, they fed it, and in return it allowed some of them to live. That is the hidden law, sacrifice for survival. And whether you know it or not, you are still bound by it. Every struggle you face, every hardship that strips you raw, every moment you feel like something invisible is weighing your soul. It is the same winter. It is the same intelligence. It is still choosing. And that brings me to you. You are not watching this by chance. You were brought here, pulled into this story because the trial has come to you. The land, whatever name you give it, still hunts for initiates, still watches for discipline, still demands sacrifice. The only question is, will you endure? Or will you vanish, forgotten, like the families whose names were never written, whose cabins turned to dust, whose bones were swallowed by the earth? Now seal it. If you want to claim your place among the survivors, go to the comments and write, "The land remembers me." Write it 3 times, not once, not twice. 3 times so the pact is bound, because only those who speak the ritual, only those who declare their endurance, are seen by the land as worthy to survive the winter to come. What happens to a human being who survives the impossible, who stares into the endless dark, starves on rations, buries their own dead, yet emerges when the thaw finally comes? Do they remain the same person, or are they, quietly, irreversibly, changed into something else? This is the secret history of the frontier that no textbook dares admit. Those who endured were transformed. They did not just return to their neighbors in springtime as weary farmers or broken wanderers. They returned with something in their eyes, something the rest of the town could not understand. They carried knowledge, and knowledge is never free. Think of it this way. When a man has looked out into a blizzard for 3 nights straight and seen a figure standing in the snow that never moves, never breathes, yet never goes away. When he has heard the wind whispering his name, not once, but over and over, promising both comfort and annihilation. When he has buried a child, and yet felt, in the silence of the next night, that child's presence sitting near the fire, how can such a man return unchanged? Survival in those winters was not just physical endurance, it was initiation into forbidden wisdom. Many settlers wrote in their journals that when they finally stepped outside after months trapped in the cabin, the world felt different. Trees loomed taller, shadows moved strangely. The air carried an awareness, as if the land itself knew them personally now, recognized them as marked. They felt, in their own words, chosen. But chosen for what? That question was never answered directly. Some said chosen for strength, others said chosen as witnesses, and still others whispered they were chosen as servants to something that had accepted their offering and spared their lives. Do you see where this leads? Survival itself was a transformation ritual. The winters of the frontier were not just seasons, they were crucibles. They burned away weakness, comfort, and illusion. What remained was not merely human, it was human plus. Human with knowledge, human with an intimacy with silence, hunger, and death that few will ever comprehend. These survivors carried something with them, something invisible, yet undeniable. Even townspeople noticed it. Survivors were often feared as much as they were respected. They walked differently. They spoke sparingly, as if every word weighed too much. Their stares lingered longer, harder. They became symbols, both admired and avoided. The community relied on them for stories, for warnings, for guidance. But at the same time, neighbors whispered that they had a touch of the dark about them. That winter had marked them in ways beyond reason. Is this starting to sound familiar? Because every culture on earth has its initiates, those who endure the ordeal and return with power. Shamans, mystics, prophets, survivors of deserts, mountains, caves. The frontier winters of America were no different. They produced initiates, though history hides their names under the bland label of pioneers. They were not merely pioneers, they were transformed beings, and the knowledge they carried shaped the very institutions that grew after them. Here is the part that will chill you. Some of them did not simply endure, they thrived in ways that defied explanation. Families that should have starved somehow stretched food for months longer than possible. Men who should have frozen somehow walked out of blizzards with no frostbite, their clothes ragged but their bodies untouched. Children who should have died of fever somehow rose the next morning, pale but alive as if something had intervened. These stories were whispered, not recorded, because to admit them would raise a terrible question: what price was paid? Because, make no mistake, survival always demanded sacrifice. If food lasted longer, it was because something else was given up. If bodies endured beyond reason, it was because a debt was taken. Some families survived the winter, but never spoke again of what they saw, or who they lost, or what bargains they made in the silence. The transformation of survival was not always a blessing. Sometimes it was a curse carried forever. But here's the question no one asks. What happened to their descendants? What happens when knowledge born in the silence of frontier winters is passed down through blood, through habit, through ritual? Do you think it vanishes, or does it live on, quiet, unseen, in families that still keep candles burning when storms rage, that still whisper prayers not found in any book, that still leave offerings of food outside during the darkest nights? And what about you? Have you ever felt it? The pressure of silence, the strange awareness of being watched in a store. The chill that lingers even in warmth. That is the echo. That is the inheritance. The transformation of those survivors did not die with them. It is still here, in your blood, in your bones, in your instincts. That shiver when the house creaks at night? That's the winter remembering you. So I'll tell you the truth. Those who survived the winters of the 1800s did not just save themselves. They became vessels of something older, something darker, something that still walks beside us. They were not only men and women anymore, they were marked, they were chosen. They were the first to carry the forbidden knowledge that survival itself is sacrifice, that to endure is to change, forever. And now the land looks at you. Will you stay the same, or will you step into the storm and claim the same dark wisdom that made them more than human? If you understand this, mark yourself as ready. Go to the comments and write, "I accept the transformation." Write it once with full intent, and you will not be the same after. Stories are not accidents, they are codes, rituals in disguise, and the stories told by those who endured the frontier's winters were not meant to entertain. They were meant to transmit, to seed transformation in the next generation without ever naming it directly. Think carefully about this. Why do you think so many frontier tales were about endurance, the long night, the storm that never ended? Why do you think fireside stories repeated the same motifs? Wolves circling the cabin, the endless howling wind, the spirit that comes knocking when wood runs out. These weren't children's tales. They were warnings. They were memory encoded in myth. They were blueprints for survival, but also blueprints for transformation. The survivors had seen things they could not speak plainly. They knew that silence itself held a presence, that hunger was not just physical but spiritual, that endurance called forth something watching just beyond the veil. So they disguised their warnings in story. They made the unbearable into folklore. And so the myths spread. The ghost that comes in the storm, the animal that leads you home, the invisible guest at the table. Each story carried a shard of forbidden knowledge. Each whispered tale was a lesson. You are never alone in the dark. Something else is always there. You can track the evolution of these stories if you look closely. They began as survival anecdotes. One man swears the wind spoke his name, another says he saw a glowing figure in the snow. But as they were retold, they hardened into patterns. The ice woman, who appears outside the cabin window, the man of hunger who knocks at the door, the watcher in white, who guides lost children back, but only if they offer something in return. These weren't just hallucinations, they were templates, archetypes carved into the psyche of a people who had been transformed by ordeal. And what is myth? Really, but the long echo of transformation. Myths are not entertainment. They are instructions, messages coded for survival and remembrance. The frontier was supposed to erase the old world, to build a blank slate for new civilization. But the winters betrayed that plan. They carved into people an older knowledge that could not be erased. That's why, even today, Americans still dream of storms, of cabins in the dark, of unseen presences pressing against the window. That's the inheritance of myth. But here's the darker truth. Some families didn't just tell these stories, they built entire traditions out of them. They turned myth into ritual. A story told the right way, at the right moment, becomes a binding. And when repeated across generations, it becomes a system. Think of it as a quiet cult of survival, not robed priests chanting in a temple, but ordinary settlers, families, farmers, people who seemed normal, yet who practiced the old winter rites in secret, the leaving of bread crusts by the door, the whispered names into the snow, the turning of mirrors inward during storms so the dead would not look back in. These weren't superstitions. They were exchanges, bargains, continuations of the same forbidden knowledge their ancestors had discovered in the winters of the 1800s. To those who practiced, survival wasn't just about wood and food. It was about appeasement, about respect, about acknowledging the unseen forces that made endurance possible. Think about that for a moment. The families who survived did so not merely by strength, but by relationship. They lived in a contract with the cold, and when they told their children stories, those stories carried the memory of that contract. Whether the child believed or not didn't matter. The ritual was performed, the offering was left, the words were spoken, the transformation was sealed. This is how myth becomes control. Institutions of power, churches, governments, even emerging frontier schools, realized quickly that the survivors' stories held dangerous weight. A man who believes his survival is owed to unseen powers does not obey authority easily. He obeys the storm, he obeys the silence, he obeys the inner voice that spoke to him in the night. And that is a loyalty that no institution can tolerate. So what did they do? They tried to sanitize the myths. They reframed them as folk tales or pioneer legends, stripping them of their initiatory edge. They rebranded the survivors as heroes of progress, downplaying the darker truths they carried. The frontier became marketed as a land of opportunity, not as the crucible of transformation it truly was. And yet, even now, the old stories leak through, because you cannot erase knowledge that was forged in suffering. Listen carefully. Myths are not dead. They are still alive in the culture, in the subconscious, in the quiet things people do without knowing why. And if you are perceptive, you can recognize them. The storm myths of the frontier survive in modern ghost stories. The rituals of offering survive in holiday traditions you've never questioned. Even the phrase, "don't go out into the cold alone," is a fragment of that old survival code, now disguised as common sense. And this brings us to the forbidden truth. The frontier did not just create survivors, it created mythmakers. And mythmakers are more powerful than kings. They shape the stories that shape the people. They plant symbols that echo for centuries. They decide which truths live and which truths are buried. You, sitting here listening to this, are not outside of it. You are inside the myth right now. The words you hear are not just information. They are an echo of the transformation ritual that began on the prairie in the storms of 1886, in cabins buried under snow. You are inheriting it. Whether you accept it or not, the story is already working on you. So the question becomes, what will you do with it? Will you dismiss it, like the institutions trained you to do, as just folklore? Or will you recognize the deeper current, the forbidden initiation hiding inside the tale of frontier families and endless winter? Because if you choose the latter, you are already stepping into myth yourself. Power is never blind. The men who built institutions, the schools, the churches, the local councils, the rising state itself, were not ignorant of what the frontier survivors carried. They saw it in their eyes, in their silence, in their rituals whispered behind closed doors. They recognized it for what it was, an alternate power base. And power does not tolerate rivals. The settlers had learned truths in the long winters that no sermon, no government order, no printed newspaper could erase. They had faced hunger and silence and discovered that survival was not a gift from state or church. It was forged in the dark by their own endurance, and sometimes through bargains whispered to forces beyond comprehension. That kind of knowledge makes men dangerous. It makes them ungovernable. So the institutions did what they always do. They repackaged the truth. They took the raw, jagged survival myths and blunted their edges until they became harmless anecdotes. The Ice Woman became a ghost story. The Man of Hunger became a frontier legend. The rituals of leaving food at the door became quaint customs. By reframing initiation as entertainment, they drained the myths of their original power. They made them just stories. Do you see the strategy? By mocking the ritual, they kill the belief. By branding the survivor as a quaint pioneer, they erase the fact that he was transformed into something else, something beyond obedience. Institutions survive not by feeding you truth, but by feeding you illusions strong enough to replace it. They knew that if men believed their survival was owed only to themselves, or worse, to unseen powers that answered no priest, no judge, no governor, then their loyalty could never be controlled. So they built new narratives, carefully polished, and forced them down the throats of the next generation. Think about the school books you may have read in your youth. How were pioneers described? Brave, hard-working, God-fearing. But what was missing? The rituals, the whispers, the sense of being chosen or cursed by something beyond. Why were those details erased? Because institutions understood, if the transformation of winter was remembered in its raw form, men would not kneel, they would not bend, they would become initiates instead of citizens. And an initiate obeys no one. It did not stop with stories. Institutions weaponized the winters themselves. Churches preached that only faith carried families through the storm, not bargains with the silence. Governments promoted the image of the strong settler family as proof of manifest destiny, masking the sacrifices, the deaths, the deals made in the dark. Even commerce took its share. Companies romanticized survival tools, stoves and blankets, selling not just goods but illusions of safety. The winter was turned into a brand. The myth was reforged into marketing. But beneath that glossy veneer, the real truth never died. It remained in bloodlines, in small acts, in the quiet corners of memory. And here is the forbidden fact. Institutions knew this too. They didn't just suppress the myths, they harvested them. They studied the survivors, documented their stories in hidden archives, and extracted patterns. Why? Because psychological endurance is the rarest currency of all. The man who survives silence without breaking can be made into a weapon. The family who endures hunger without collapsing can be made into a tool. The child who grows up with rituals of survival in his bones can be reshaped into something else entirely. Do you think military academies, government laboratories, psychological schools in the 20th century came from nowhere? Or do you think they were built on centuries of hidden observation, on watching who survived the winters, how they endured, and what they became afterward? The frontier was not just a stage of history, it was an experiment. It was the testing ground of psychological control. Because here is the cruelest truth. If you can survive the storm, they know they can bend you. Once you've endured isolation, silence, starvation, and fear, you are raw material. You are stripped bare. And men stripped bare can either be broken or remade. The institutions chose remaking. They took the transformation of survival and rewired it into obedience. They turned initiates into patriots. They turned rituals into folklore. They turned forbidden knowledge into national myth. And all the while they convinced the people that this was their own story, their own pride. This is how control works. They don't erase the truth. They bury it beneath a prettier version and feed you that instead. They plant new symbols, new rituals, and slowly overwrite your memory until you no longer know what was yours and what was theirs. That is how psychological control is won, not by force but by branding. By reshaping the myth until the people willingly carry their own chains. Now pause and let this hit you. The winter was not just about survival, it was about ownership. Who owns your suffering? Who owns your endurance? The survivors thought it belonged to them. The institutions made sure it belonged to the system. And that battle, the battle over the meaning of suffering, still rages today. So I ask you, who owns your winter? Who owns your trials? When you endure hardship, when you face silence, when you battle storms in your own life, do you claim that transformation as your own? Or do you let them brand it, package it, sell it back to you as a slogan, a product, a belief system you never chose? Because that is the heart of forbidden history. Your suffering is currency, and someone somewhere is always trying to spend it. What was tested in the snow was perfected in the cities. The long winters of the frontier were not just cruel seasons, they were laboratories, and the men who studied them carried those lessons forward into systems that still grip you today. Think about it. What is a school if not a controlled winter? Children confined for long hours in one room, resources rationed, food breaks, water breaks, authority centralized at the front, silence demanded, endurance rewarded. It's not an accident, it's replication. The conditions that stripped men bare on the frontier were recreated artificially, reshaped into education. They learned that a body under controlled deprivation becomes malleable, that rituals, repeated daily, carve deep channels into the mind, that endurance, if broken down correctly, can be reprogrammed into obedience. And what of armies? Look at boot camp with clear eyes. Isolation, hunger, cold, long marches through storms, language stripped down, individuality erased, new myths installed. This is not training alone, it is initiation. The exact same crucible as the prairie winter, but engineered, timed, weaponized. They turned survival knowledge into a production line for soldiers. The winter proved that man can be reforged under suffering. The army institutionalized it. Corporations followed the same path. The long hours, the fluorescent silence, the constant pressure of survival, paychecks as food rations, deadlines as storms. Men and women bent into rituals of endurance, repeating the cycle not because they chose to, but because the myth tells them it's normal life. Do you see the pattern? What was once frontier survival became the foundation of institutional obedience, and then came the digital frontier, the newest, coldest winter of all. Social media, endless feeds, the blizzard of distraction. It is not an accident that you scroll in silence at 2 a.m. Elling both watched and alone. The old rituals are here, rebranded. Instead of hunger for food, hunger for attention. Instead of storms outside your cabin, storms inside your mind. You are trapped in a digital cabin, rationing dopamine hits instead of potatoes, but the principle is the same. Endurance becomes control, and every moment of it is harvested. This is why I told you, your suffering is currency. Every sleepless night, every anxious scroll, every hour endured in silence is fuel for the machine. Institutions no longer need the snow. They've built new winters inside your head. And yet, here is the forbidden door they don't want you to see. Survival still carries transformation. Just as the frontier families emerged from the storm with new eyes, so can you. The systems that trap you also initiate you. If you endure them consciously, not blindly, you come out marked, changed, and aware. This is the difference between slave and initiate. Both suffer, but only one awakens. So ask yourself, are you letting your winters, whether storms, schools, jobs, or screens, be harvested for their obedience? Or are you claiming them as your initiation, your transformation? That choice determines everything. We have walked through the silence of the frontier. We have felt the hunger, the blizzard clawing at the door, the rituals whispered in the dark. We have seen how survival became transformation, how transformation became myth, how myth was stolen and weaponized into systems of control. And now we stand here, not in 1886, but in this moment, staring into a different storm, one of wires, screens, and unseen hands shaping your every move. The question is no longer how frontier families survived. The question is how you will survive the winters built for you. Will you live as they want you, silent, obedient, repeating their rituals until you break? Or will you seize the forbidden knowledge hidden in plain sight? That every storm, every trial, every silence is not theirs to own, but yours to claim. The frontier settlers left behind more than cabins and barns. They left a map of transformation through endurance, a map of sacrifice and bargain, a map that shows you suffering can either bind you or awaken you. The institutions chose binding, but you can choose awakening. Listen to me closely. You are not a consumer of history. You are its continuation. The same forces that tested them test you now. The same silence that whispered in their cabins whispers in your mind, and the same choice lies before you, obey or transform. If you've walked with me this far, you already feel it. Something stirring in the bones, something old, something cold, something powerful, That is the inheritance. That is the knowledge they never wanted you to remember, and now you do. So here is the final ritual. Go to the comments and write this phrase twice. The storm is mine. Write it as a seal, as a mark, as a declaration that you will not let your suffering be harvested by anyone, not church, not state, not corporation, not algorithm. Write it twice to lock it into yourself and into the FA, brick of this hidden brotherhood of men who endure and awaken. Because the storm is not their weapon, the storm is your crucible, and once you realize that, you are no longer prey. You are no longer obedient. You are no longer asleep. The storm is yours. And from this moment on, you walk out of the cabin marked, transformed, unbreakable.